So without further ado, we can get started. Welcome everyone to the second week of our workshop. If this is your first time in the workshop series, welcome aboard. The first workshop is posted on YouTube, so if you want to catch up, you could go ahead and watch the video after this lesson. All right, and as you may have guessed, based on the announcements and the look of this title page, we're going to be working on the sounds of your conlang. The first workshop, which is the introduction to conlanging, and during that week, you worked on a task where you were ideating your conlang. So you were deciding on the purpose of your conlang, how your conlang would want to look. You were also looking into inspirations from natural languages that you may want to use for your conlang. And today, we're going to bring your conlang ideas to life and work on the sounds of your conlang. And so far, again, I have seen all your responses, and generally they're all spoken conlangs, not signed conlangs. So there is going to be a bias toward spoken conlangs for this workshop. All right. And in this workshop, we're going to start with phonetics. We're going to introduce speech sounds and how our vocal tract creates sound. After that, we're going to look into sound systems. So how do languages organize sounds? How do languages pick sounds? And afterwards, we're going to look into phonotactics and allophony. So how do the sounds in language change in their environment? How are they arranged? And afterward, we're going to look into intonation, stress, tone, length, just generally other levels. These are other elements of phonetic that supplement speech sound, that supplement vowels and consonants. And we're generally going to brush through parts 3 and part 4. The main purpose of this workshop is to build a sound inventory. So we're going to work on the phonology of your conlang. But I am including things like phonotactics, allophony, prosody, just to give you somewhat of an idea of maybe how to make a more naturalistic conlang. But again, the main purpose is choosing the sounds of your conlang. And we are going to be using a lot of symbols from the International Phonetic Alphabet. This is probably the most widely used transcription system to transcribe speech sounds. And for this workshop, I did link a PDF with my announcement 15 minutes ago containing the International Phonetic Alphabet chart, as well as a chart graphing the parts of the vocal tract. So if you would like to follow along in this workshop, I would recommend you referring to that packet I gave you as well. Let's dive into phonetics. So it's important for us to look into how we produce speech sounds, and it all comes from the vocal tract. So the vocal tract starts in the larynx, and this is essentially your voice box. And from the larynx, air flows to the pharynx over here, and this is pretty much the throat of your vocal tract. It contains the epiglottis, and basically what that is, it's a flap that closes in on the larynx so that when you eat food, it goes through your mouth and it enters the esophagus, so it doesn't enter your larynx. So thank God for the epiglottis, or else we would have choked, I guess. So above the pharynx, we have the oral cavity, and this is where much of the speech sounds we're going to deal with today are articulated, because there are many, many parts of the oral cavity. So this is essentially the mouth, but it also includes the lip, the teeth, the tongue, the roof of the mouth, etc., etc. And above the oral cavity, we do have a very large space called the nasal cavity. This is the cavity behind your nose. So it does also play a role in articulating sounds. And as you may have guessed, different ways of orienting different parts of the vocal tract change the way the sound sounds. And any sound that comes out of the vocal tract is a speech sound or a phone. And you could further divide this into vowels and consonants from learning languages, or maybe from linguistics, from any linguistics class you've taken before, or any linguistics you've learned before. You may have an idea of what a vowel is or what a consonant is already, but we will be going into vowels and consonants in the next slide. Speech sounds are going to be written within square brackets like this. So these are examples of consonant and vowel sounds within square brackets. These are speech sounds. And as you may have guessed, the study of speech sounds is called phonetics. So let's get started with vowels. A vowel is a speech sound formed with an unrestricted flow of air from the lungs. So if you scream, or if you say that's an unrestricted airflow. It's going from your lungs directly out of your mouth. There's no obstacles in your vocal tract changing the way it sounds. So it's a vowel. And at a very basic level, they're distinguished by height or openness. They're distinguished by backness or frontedness, and they're distinguished by roundedness. And I like to think of vowels as being in a spectrum. So although languages tend to handpick specific vowels, you could change a vowel from you could go from one vowel to another gradually by changing the height gradually or changing the backness gradually. So I could go from E in a very fluid manner. So vowels are not as discrete as we think. They're more of, you could think of it as lying in a color palette. So vowel height refers to how raised or lowered your jaw is. So I want to direct you to this sound, E, like in the English word meat, read, bean, lead, feed, etc. So your jaw is pretty close to the roof of your mouth. So we could call this a closed vowel. We could also call it the high vowel because your jaw is at a high position. And as you lower your jaw from E, you get to So you typically find that in languages like Spanish, a lot of Romance languages. Then you could go even lower, lower your jaw more. Like in the English word men, bet, dread. Even in the word etc., there's an vowel. And if you go even lower to an open vowel, you have like at, rat, ad, etc., etc. So if your jaw is much closer to the roof of your mouth, we call that a closed vowel. And as you gradually open your jaw more, it becomes an open vowel. And we could also go to the other side of the vowel chart here. So let's say we have the oo sound, like in the English word oo in some dialects. If you open your jaw a bit, or if you lower your jaw, it's going to turn to oh, and then ah, and then ah. So as you open your jaw more, it becomes more like an ah-like sound or an ah-like sound. Now, another way to distinguish vowels is backness or frontness. And this is basically the position of your tongue with respect to how far away it is from your lips or your throat. So I want you to make an oo sound like in moon. And I also want you to make a aw sound or an ah sound like in father or bored or pollen. If you notice your tongue is a bit bunched, it's kind of like hiding in the back of your mouth. And this is what we call the back position of your tongue. It's all the way back in your vocal tract. But as you move your tongue forward, as you direct it toward your teeth or your lips, it becomes more fronted. So you could go from ooh to e. So while ooh is much more bunched in the mouth, e has a much more flatter structure, I would say. It's kind of more stretched. It's more directed toward the teeth. So generally we have the back sounds ooh, ah, and ah. Then as you go front, it goes from and ah. And we could also distinguish vowels based on roundedness. So this is essentially the shape of your lips when you're pronouncing the vowel. So if you look in the screen or if you're referring to the packet I gave you, you may notice that in certain points of the vowel chart, you have two sets of vowels. You have a pair of vowels in each point. Generally, in the IPA chart, we write unrounded vowels to the left and rounded vowels to the right. So unrounded vowels means that your lips are not in like an O shape, as you see in this graphic here, while rounded vowels are more like an O shape. So for example, we have the E vowel in meat. If you slowly make your lips more rounded from E to U, that U sound is exhibited in French, for example, and German, and is distinguished from U. So again, we have unrounded vowels, which is more like a flat shape in your lips, and rounded vowels is more of like an O shape. And if you recall, I did mention that vowels kind of exist in a spectrum. And as a matter of fact, you could make vowels glide into other vowels in a much more fluid manner. And if this is exhibited in the same syllable, we call this a diphthong. So for example, in the English word I, it goes from ah to e. So it turns from an open vowel to a more closed vowel, or like in the English word house. So it goes from an open, unrounded vowel to a closed, rounded vowel, and a back vowel too. In Portuguese, you could also see other diphthongs like céu, which means sky, and coisa, which means thing. And if you already know the IPA, if you know the International Phonetic Alphabet already, you might find these transcriptions a bit weird. And I just want to say that there's many ways to write a diphthong in IPA. Sometimes people put a little hat below the second vowel to indicate that it's not syllabic. I'm writing it this way so that I feel like it's easier to explain how diphthongs work as vowels adjacent to other vowels or vowels that glide into other vowels in the same syllable. And sometimes you could write a diphthong as a consonant or as a vowel and a consonant, and we call that second vowel an approximant. We can get into consonants now. So while vowels are unrestricted airflows in the vocal tract, a consonant has some kind of restricted airflow. So there's some kind of obstacle that you're articulating in your vocal tract, or specifically your oral cavity, to produce a consonant. So at the basic level, they're distinguished by place of articulation, the manner of articulation, and voicing. And you'll see in a second that these three elements of consonants kind of make it more discrete as compared to vowels, which seem like they're more in a spectrum, right? So the place of articulation indicates where in the vocal tract the consonant is produced, or specifically where in the oral cavity the consonant is produced. So the IPA chart is very intuitive in explaining place of articulation because it goes from the front of the mouth to the back of the mouth. So from your lips all the way to your throat. So our first set of places of articulation are based on the lips. So we have bilabial. Bilabial consonants are produced using both lips. So from the root bi, which means two, labial, which means lips, using both lips. And for example, we have sound pa, ba, ma, like in man, ball, very, very common sounds throughout languages in the world. Also, labiodental consonants, where you use your upper teeth and your lower lip to articulate the sound. So, say the word flattering or funny, where you could notice the first consonant is making you use your lower lip, touch the upper teeth, like in fa and va. Our next set of places of articulation uses the front part of your tongue. So, dental consonants are made with the front part of your tongue against the upper teeth. So if you could touch your upper teeth and pronounce a consonant there, it's going to be a dental consonant. The. We have these sounds in English. These sounds also exist in Greek. The is also in European Spanish too. And if you move your tongue a bit more back, you're going to feel a little bump right after your teeth. And we call this the alveolar ridge. So consonants articulated in that area is called an alveolar consonant. So for example, we have ta, da, na, ra. These are extremely, extremely common sounds throughout languages. Again, you have sa, za. And if you move it a bit more back, you're going to get to post-alveolar consonants. So make a sa sound, like sa, 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 and move your tongue a bit more back to the mouth. So sa, sa, sha, 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 like in the word shimmer, or shine, or shame, or the ja in the word vision. These are post-alveolar consonants, and they're a bit harder to differentiate to some people, maybe because some languages do not exhibit a contrast between alveolar sounds and post-alveolar sounds. Now, if you move your tongue a bit more back, you're going to reach the roof of your mouth, or what we call the hard palate. And if you articulate the hard palate with the front part of your tongue, you're going to get a retroflex sound. So that includes da, da, na. These are sounds very, very common in the Indian subcontinent. Now, let's say you're going to articulate a sound in your hard palate, but instead of the front part of your tongue, you're going to use the body of your tongue. What you're going to get is a palatal consonant. So it's the body of the tongue against the hard palate. So the most common palatal sound probably is ya, like in the English word yes, year. There's also sounds like nya and ya that exist in many, many Romance languages like Italian. Going a bit more back, if we use the back part of our tongue, you could actually feel a bump if you go towards your throat from the hard palate. So slowly move your tongue from the hard palate to the back of your throat. You're gonna feel this bump called the soft palate, or the velum. And consonants articulated in that area are velar consonants. So these include ka, ga, na. These are very, very common sounds, specifically ka. And if you look in the mirror, if you look at your mouth, you're gonna see this bulb, this bulb shape hanging at the front part of your throat, the top of your throat. That's called your uvula. So if you move the back of your tongue a bit more back and you articulate a consonant there, you're going to get uvular consonants like ba, ba, ma, va. You'll see that in Arabic, in French, languages in the Caucasus, many languages in North America and the Andes. And lastly, we have last set of places of articulation. If you go all the way to the root of your tongue, you're going to get pharyngeal consonants. So this is articulated in that throat area. And if you don't speak Arabic, or if you don't speak a language natively from the Caucasus, it's going to be pretty hard to pronounce. Even for me, it's kind of hard to pronounce. These are sounds like ha and hua. Last but not least, we have glottal consonants, which are produced using the glottis. So the glottis is the opening between the vocal folds. So it's basically the entrance of your larynx. So if you say uh-oh, between and o, you just made a glottal sound. Or if you say happy, ha sound is a glottal sound. In fact, the h sound, the glottal fricative, is very peculiar in that it's the only consonant sound that is technically not made using by obstructing the airflow or by making some kind of obstacle in your airflow. But we kind of do count it as a consonant because it is a turbulent sound, which we're going to get to in more detail in the next slides. So now that we have places of articulation, we can now talk about manner of articulation. So how a consonant is articulated in the oral cavity. So first we have stops. So stops are consonants that completely obstruct airflow in the oral cavity. So if you say ba, ba, da, da, you're kind of creating this air pressure in your oral cavity, and it creates a burst sound because you're completely obstructing the airflow. So we call these sounds plosives. It's a certain kind of stop where the airflow is obstructed everywhere. But if you have only obstructed in the oral cavity and you let air flow through the nasal cavity, you get nasal stops or nasal sounds. So like ma, na, nga. Even though your mouth may be completely closed, if you let air flow out of your nasal cavity, you're going to get these nasal stop sounds. Next, we have trills and taps. So trills are consonants produced using vibrations between your tongue or lips and the passive articulator. So your passive articulator is basically the place of articulation or the part of your oral cavity that doesn't move. So for example, we have ra. So that's done by creating airflow between your tongue, the front of your tongue, and your alveolar ridge. And it's a very, very slight, there's a slight distance between your tongue and the alveolar ridge such that the airflow is gonna vibrate the tongue. Likewise, we also have taps and taps or flaps, and they're kind of like trills, but they're produced by throwing the active articulator to the passive articulator. So for example, ra. So it's kind of like hitting your tongue against that passive articulator. So you could think of it as a very quick plosive. You could maybe also think of it as like one single unit of a trill, but it tends to be its own thing. So you see taps in, for example, Spanish. Spanish has both ra and ra. Japanese also has ta. And next we have fricatives and approximants. So if you create a bit more space between your active and passive articulators between your tongue and the other part of your oral cavity, you're going to get a fricative. And that's when you have airflow going in between your tongue and the passive articulator, but it's still narrow such that it's going to make a turbulent sound. It's kind of like white noise. So say the consonant or sh or sha. It's very breathy. And if you create that space between your tongue and the parts of your oral cavity a bit more wide, you're going to get an approximant, which is kind of like a vowel acting as a glide. So it's made where the channel is not narrow enough for turbulent airflow. So it pretty much sounds like a vowel, like again with a palatal approximant, ya, like in yes, year, yam. It's kind of like an E vowel, except I turn it into a consonant, or it's not syllabic. Now with fricatives, we also have affricates, which are consonants that start as plosives and end as fricatives. So take the English word church, for example, or the ch sound in church. It starts with a ta, a post-alveolar ta sound, and it leads on with a sha. Italian also has za, pa in German, ka in many languages in North America. And if you notice in this chart, you'll see lateral fricative and lateral approximant. So a lateral sound is specifically where part of your oral cavity is fully obstructed, but there is some kind of hole in either side of your tongue or in one side of your tongue where air flows much more freely. So make an all sound or a la sound like in light, lamb, all. When you make that all sound, you're completely obstructing airflow in the middle of your mouth, but the airflow goes freely at the sides of your tongue. And if you make that space a bit more narrow, you're gonna go from a lateral approximant to a lateral fricative. Da, da. These are sounds that you see in Mongolian and Welsh and Greenlandic. Now, with matter of articulation, you could also separate sounds into obstruents and sonorants. So obstruents are consonants produced by obstructing airflow. So you either fully obstruct airflow or you make the sound turbulent. And that's how you get plosives, fricatives, affricates, even lateral fricatives, lateral affricates. These are all obstruent sounds. Anything that's not an obstruent is a sonorant. So it's a speech sound produced with continuous, non-turbulent airflow. So as long as your breath lasts, you could pretty much endlessly pronounce a sonorant sound. So nasal sounds like ma, na, nga, even though the oral cavity is completely obstructed, airflow is still moving freely through the nasal cavity. Vowels are also considered as sonorant sounds. As long as your breath lasts, you could pronounce a vowel. With consonants, we do have voicing. And from the name, it's whether a consonant is voiced or voiceless. So voice is specifically where your vocal folds, remember your glottis, it creates vibrations. If you pronounce a vowel and you record that and you slow it down, it's going to sound a bit like clicks. And it's basically your vocal folds like clapping each other. So I want you to put maybe 2 fingers against your neck and say the word saucy, sassy. The S sound, the sa sa sa, you're not really gonna feel anything in your neck, except maybe when you lead onto the vowel. But generally, when you say s, it doesn't feel like anything. Now say the word pizzazz, zebra, lose. That z sound, it feels like you're gonna feel a vibration in your neck, and that's pretty much what voicing is. And that vibration is caused by your vocal folds vibrating. Now, all the sounds we've dealt with involve some kind of action with the lungs, and it's based on air pressure from the lungs. So air goes from the lungs all the way to your vocal tract. We call these pulmonic sounds. But there are consonants that you can produce without the need of air pressure from the lungs, and we call these non-pulmonic consonants. And there's 3 main types. So first we have clicks, which is like a sucking action in your mouth while enclosing the back of the mouth. You're kind of sucking air in, but you're also enclosing that soft pellet, that veal. You'll see a lot of click consonants. You'll tend to only see click consonants as consonants in sub-Saharan Africa. Certain Bantu languages like Xhosa or Zulu, many Khoisan languages too, like or Ndebele. And then we have implosives, which is kind of like a click, except you're not enclosing the back of the mouth. You're kind of letting that air flow. And because of that, you're pulling the glottis down. So it kind of forces a voice in that sound. So try to make a b or da sound, but kind of go backwards, like ba, da, ga. You'll see these in languages like Vietnamese, some dialects of Khmer. I think Hausa also exhibits ba, da, and ga. Ga is a bit more rare. It's easier to make implosive sounds that are more front in the mouth. And we also have ejectives, where it's a consonant pronounced while holding your breath. So try holding your breath, not too long though, because I don't want you to pass out. And try to make a puss sound. You're gonna end up getting it's kind of like a really loud microphone banging sound. And you see these sounds in Georgian. They appear a lot in other Caucasian languages. You'll see them in the Andes also with Quechua. But when you pronounce it with a vowel, it's gonna sound like so you're kind of covering your glottis while pronouncing that plosive sound or any voiceless sound. You're not going to get a voiced ejective because, again, you're closing your glottis. So it's not going to produce any vibration in the vocal tract. So that was phonetics. If you do not know the International Phonetic Alphabet, I know we dealt with a lot of IPA symbols in this workshop. If you're still unfamiliar with it, I highly recommend going to a website like Interactive IPA Chart. It's going to display an IPA chart, and you could click on any of the speech sounds, and it'll give you an audio recording of someone pronouncing that sound. And for conlanging purposes or any linguistics purposes, if you're using a computer, it's pretty hard to type IPA on your regular keyboard. So I recommend an online IPA keyboard. It's going to display a lot of the IPA symbols. Now, with that being said, we can look into how language organizes sounds. So just a reminder, there is no language that has all the speech sounds in the world, all the speech sounds that you can produce. That doesn't exist. Languages have a tendency to select certain sounds to convey meaning. So it has an inventory of specific speech sounds, and we call these phonemes. So in the IPA, or actually any kind of phonetic transcription, when you're writing phonemes, you place them in between slashes. So for example, ra, that could be a phoneme in Spanish or Italian. La, that's a phoneme exhibited in Nuhak or Nawat. That's a phoneme in French. You see that in English. And it's important to recognize what a phoneme is, because if you change a phoneme in a certain word, you're going to get a new word. And we call these minimal pairs. So minimal pairs are words that only differ based on one phoneme. So there's a single phoneme difference. And if you're a linguist and you're documenting some kind of language, and maybe you're involved with phonology or you're writing a grammar, you would want to look at minimal pairs in order to identify what the phonemes are. So for example, in English, we have the word cat. If we change the k sound at the front of the word to maybe a p sound, we get pat. Pat is a totally different word from cat. So we could tell that k and p are phonemes, distinct phonemes in English. And the study of how phonemes are organized in language, or the actual inventory of phonemes that a language has, is what we call phonology. So let's look at different phonological inventories together. So here's the consonant inventory of English. We have 3 nasal sounds, ma, na, nga, though in English, nga cannot start a word. You only see that in between vowels or at the end of words, or at the end of a syllable specifically. We have 3 sets of plosives, aba, kada, and kaga. We also have a set of affricates, cha, ja, sha, ja, which is pretty common in European languages. And a lot of the plosives and fricatives are differentiated based on voicing again. So we have ba and ba. So ba is voiced, ba is voiced, va. Ba is voiceless, va is voiced, etc., etc. We have 3 sets of approximants, wa, ra, and ya. And if you look here, wa appears in both the bilabial section and the velar. So it's both a bilabial approximant and a velar approximant. And wa is kind of a special case because we call this a labiovelar approximant. So when you pronounce wa, not only are you articulating both of your lips, you're also kind of bunching your tongue a bit toward the soft palate. So you're dealing with 2 places of articulation at once when you're pronouncing wa. And lastly, we have our super cool solo lateral approximant la. And let's compare this to Hawaiian. For example, Hawaiian has a much, much smaller consonant inventory. So with respect to consonants, Hawaiian needs to distinguish words in other ways aside from consonants because of its small inventory. So Hawaiian has mana, only has 3 plosives, pa, ka, and a. In some dialects, the ka is alveolar, so pa, ta, a. It has the fricative ha, which is pretty common, and it has wa or va. So when you see a tilde in a phonological inventory, it's probably going to mean that it's in free variation. So for Hawaiian specifically, you could pronounce it as wa or va, but it's the same phoneme. If you pronounce it either way, it's not going to change the word. And you have the singular lateral approximant la. And for vowel inventories, let's look at Spanish. So this is a 5 vowel inventory, I, U, E, O, A. And it's a pretty common structure of vowels throughout the world languages. You'll tend to see these 5 vowels appear, and specifically the 3 vowels I, A, and U, because they're kind of at the extremes of each other. Now, if we compare it to something like German, we get a very, very large inventory. Germanic languages like German, English, especially Danish, they have a lot of vowels, a lot of anemic vowels. So, for example, we have O, E, and I, U, U. And if you notice, there's a colon-like symbol here that indicates vowel length, and we're going to get to vowel length or just general speech sound length in a second. Now that we have phonemes, this is part 3 and part 4 of today's workshop, and again, we are kind of going to brush through this because the main part was all about vowels, consonants, and the phonological inventory. But I do want to talk about other things like phonotactics and allophony, prosody. I maybe want to give you some suggestions on how to make your conlang a bit more naturalistic if you would like that. All right, so how are phonemes organized or arranged? So languages have different rules about how phonemes are combined. So, for example, take a set of phonemes, bows. That sounds like an English word, but when we say bzo, it doesn't sound like English because it disobeys English's consonant cluster rules. So in English, you cannot have a fricative come after a plosive when it starts a syllable. So bzo is kind of an invalid word in English, but bows is a valid word. And rules on how syllables are constructed, what consonants can go beside each other, what vowels can go beside each other. These are all phonotactic rules. And when you make phonotactic rules in your conlang, it's important to determine what a syllable looks like in your conlang. So a syllable very basically is a basic sequence of speech sounds. So it's composed of an onset, it's the beginning consonant or beginning consonants of a syllable, and it has a rhyme. So the rhyme is kind of like the lifeblood of a syllable. The onset of a syllable is mandatory. Generally in most, if not all languages, you don't need an onset, but you do need a rhyme. A rhyme is always required for a syllable. And within the rhyme, we have the nucleus. That's also kind of the syllable's body or like the life of the syllable. Generally, it's vowels, but it could be consonants as well. And then you have a coda, which ends the syllable. If you have a coda, you could call it the closed syllable, but if there's no coda, it's an open syllable. And not all languages allow codas, which we'll get to in the next slide. But here's an example. So we have the word bring. So bra is the onset. These are the onset consonants. Ing is the rhyme. And I represents the nucleus. And ng is the coda. So bra, ing, bring. Now, different languages construct syllables in vastly different ways. So since we're speaking English, let's look at English first. We could cluster a lot of consonants together, generally mostly 3 for an onset and 4 for a coda. So take the word strengths, for example. So sa, ta, and ra act as the onset. Is the vowel. Again, the nucleus, the rhyme or the nucleus is required in a syllable. Then nths is the coda consonants. Sometimes people attach a k sound in the middle of and make it strengths. So that renders it as 4 consonants. We also have the word sixths, which is kind of a mouthful, very, very terrible word, I know, but that's 4 codas in a row. And if you look at languages like Hawaiian, for example, it only allows 1 onset before the vowel, and it doesn't allow any coda consonants. So for example, we have the word ai, which means yes. Ai is a diphthong between I and e. And we have the word ono, which means 6. In Turkish, at least not for loanwords, specifically for native words in Turkish, you're allowed 1 consonant as an onset and 2 consonants as a coda. So take the word aşk, for example, which means love, or ben, which means I or me. Ben has 1 onset, 1 coda, and aşk has no onset but 2 codas. With that being said, phonemes are also not constant. They don't always stay the same. And depending on its environment, your phoneme is naturally going to change into something else. So get the palm of your hand and put it in the front of your mouth, or you could get a piece of paper and lay that at the front of your mouth. And I want you to pronounce the word tick. You may feel a breathy sound enter your palm, or you may see that your paper moves a bit because there's this breathy sound after the t. But then say the word stick, you're not really gonna get the same breathy sound. And generally, English speakers, specifically American English speakers or British English speakers, because this is an element in their dialect, they're not going to notice the difference between the t in tick and the t in stick. So phonemically, it remains as a t sound, but how we're actually pronouncing it is that the t in tick has a much more breathy sound. So we call this an aspirated sound, while in stick, because the s onset, it kind of cancels out that breathiness, specifically in English. So because of this change, we can say that t, the aspirated t sound, is an allophone of the phoneme t when it is an onset and when it is not beside another consonant. So allophones are different ways to pronounce a phoneme depending on its environment. So depending on where it is in the syllable or what sounds are beside it. So let's look at more allophone examples. So another one in American English, we have the word butter. And phonemically, as an American English speaker, I'm gonna picture that t sound in between ba and as a normal t sound. But what I'm actually doing phonetically is I'm rendering that t sound into ra. It becomes a flap. So in between vowels, that t becomes ra. So we could say that ra is an allophone of t in between vowels. In Spanish, for example, we have the word lobo, and generally Spanish speakers may not differentiate ba from va, but ba in between vowels becomes lenited. It becomes a fricative. So from lobo to lobo. And vowels are also no exception to allophony as well, like in Arabic. So we have the word qamar, phonemically qamar, which means moon. What the qa is doing, so this is a uvular plosive, it kind of pulls back on that a vowel, so it becomes qama. This second syllable might not really be accurate, but I'm trying to make you guys pay attention to the first syllable here with what's happening to the a sound. So because that qa pulls back that a, we could say that a is an allophone of a when it's next to a uvular consonant. We're almost at the final stretch, guys. Don't worry. So now that we talked about vowels and consonants, we talked about syllables, and we talked about changes in your phonemes, there's another layer of phonetics that we can implement into the sound system of our conlangs, and it deals with prosody. Prosody deals with elements of speech sounds beyond what we see in vowels and consonants. So it goes beyond the place of articulation or height or backness. It adds an additional layer to these speech sounds. So these can include pitch or tone, stress, intonation. Pitch refers to how high or low a sound is. So when I talk like this versus when I speak like this. And when pitch distinguishes meaning in a language, we could call that language as a tonal language. We could say that language has tones. So for example, a pretty well-known tonal language is Mandarin or Mandarin Chinese. If you say ma, it means mother. But if you make it have a dipping tone, ma, it means horse. And ma, a falling tone, means scold. You'll see a lot of tonal languages in Africa, for example, with Igbo, which is primarily spoken in Nigeria. Let's take the word aqua, for example. So if you say aqua, both high tones, it's going to mean cry. But if you say aqua, it means egg. And if you say agua, both low tones, it's going to mean cloth or sue. So when you're making your conlang, if you are interested in tones, think about how tones change meaning, or think about how the pitch changes meaning in your language. Another element of prosody is length, and length basically refers to how long a speech sound is pronounced. So there are many languages on Earth that contrast short sounds and long sounds. So you could have short and long vowels or short and long consonants. So we tend to call long consonants geminates or geminate consonants. So let's take Finnish, for example. In the Finnish language, vowel length and geminate consonants are phonemic, which means that changing the length will change the meaning. For example, in the word silli, it means herring. But let's say we change the length, the la, to be a bit shorter, and we change the first vowel e into a longer vowel. So we have silli, and that now means hedgehog. It's not a mispronunciation of herring. American English also has length, but it's not phonemic. It's more allophonic. So take the word back, for example. The a is quite short, but if you say bag, that a is a bit longer. So the rule set in American English is that if your coda is a voiced consonant, what's likely going to happen is that it's going to lengthen the nucleus. It's going to lengthen the vowel. So we have back and bag. Generally for American English, some dialects in the United States do not feature this, but mine does. And with pitch and length, you could also combine that into stress. So stress is basically the emphasis of a syllable. So you're giving a syllable prominence with respect to other syllables. So it could affect the syllable's pitch, length, or even the volume of a syllable. And you could categorize languages by whether they have stress or not. So if it does have stress, it's a stress-timed language. And stressed syllables generally have an equal duration, but it's much more emphasized than other syllables. It could be much more longer or much more high-pitched or much more loud. So for example, the word remarkable in English, the mar is a bit longer than the other syllables like ra, ka, and bul. Remarkable. But if your language does not exhibit stress, it could be a syllable-timed language. So the duration of every syllable is going to be equal. So French is an example of a syllable-timed language. Is going to be no distinction in how long, how loud, or how high or low each syllable is going to be. Now, another feature of prosody is intonation. So intonation refers to the rise and fall of pitch in a statement. So when you do this, it's going to have some kind of pragmatic effect in your statement or your sentence or your clause. And generally, they could be used to express sentence type. So sentences in your language could have different intonations than indicative statements or commands or obligations, or your intonation could change based on the speaker's attitude or their emotions or their perceptions on the other speaker. So take this sentence, for example, your name is Jay. It kind of drops as an indicative statement. But if I ask it as a yes or no question, is your name Jay? It rises and falls and rises again with emphasis on Jay. And if it's an interrogative question, who is Jay? It rises and then it dips. We are not making sentences yet with our conlangs, but you could have some sort of idea about what kind of intonation you may want to have. With that being said, we can talk about our second task for this conlanging series. So the task for week 2. And this week, I want you to develop your conlang sounds. So I want you to make a phonological inventory of your conlang's consonants and your vowels based on your ideas. So a lot of you mentioned that you're trying to seek inspiration or you're trying to look into other natural languages. Like some of you mentioned Thai, some of you mentioned Korean, etc., etc. So look into those languages more. Search up their phonologies, sort of their sound system, and maybe you could build your phonological inventory based on what kind of sounds they have. But as an extra challenge, maybe you could include a phoneme that you wouldn't see in one of the NatLang inspirations. So for example, let's say I'm basing my conlang on Thai. I know Thai has varying degrees of plosive consonants, but what if I want to add like lateral fricatives like and pla? Maybe it could work in my conlang despite it being inspired by Thai. So try to challenge yourself. If you don't, that's totally fine, but it's just a suggestion. So for this task, if you don't know the International Phonetic Alphabet, you do not have to use it, but you do have a week to make this. And I do recommend that you get more into the basics of IPA because IPA is a very practical way of expressing sound through text. But if you don't, it's fine. You could describe sounds as, for example, this CH is like a H in German, or you could compare it to what other languages feature. And an optional thing you could do for this task is devise a romanization system. So it's quite tedious and hard to transcribe words in IPA when you don't have a writing system either. So I do suggest, for simplicity's sake and for your own benefit, create a Latin alphabet system at first before we get into the writing workshop so that it's much easier for you to make notes on sounds of your conlang. So have an IPA inventory if you want, and maybe transcribe those IPA sounds into a Latin alphabet system. And I'll show you an example in just a second. With that, if you do want to make it a bit more naturalistic, try to think about things like phonotactic rules. So how is the syllable structured in your conlang? What consonant clusters can exist? What consonants are not allowed to be beside each other? Does your conlang have diphthongs or triphthongs or adjacent vowels in your language? Can syllables end in a coda? How big can an onset be? How big can a coda be? You could also think about allophonic rules. So how do your phonemes change in its environment? What happens if this certain phoneme is beside this other phoneme? What happens if your phoneme is in between vowels or in between consonants? You also think about prosodic features. So is there stress in your conlang? Does stress influence meaning? Is stress regular, or does stress change depending on word? Or does your conlang have tone or pitch? And again, we're not making full-on sentences yet, but you could also ideate what your intonation, what you would want your intonation to be like. So you don't have to work on this. The most important thing for this task is your sound inventory, but I do highly suggest this. And if you do work on phonotactic rules, allophonic rules, etc., create a simple list of words in your conlang already, just to show examples of these rules. All right, so I'm going to show you an example of what I did for this task for my conlang. So this is the consonant inventory I made for my conlang. We have 4 sets of plosives, and if you notice here, there's only a voiced bilabial plosive ba, there's no pa, and there's also a uvular plosive pa. And it's pretty common for a language to have a uvular plosive be voiceless without a voiced counterpart. The voiced uvular plosive is actually kind of rare. But if you like that sound, then feel free to add it to your nasal consonants, trill, r. I also import fricatives, which do not distinguish, which aren't distinguished by voice. They're rather distinguished solely by place of articulation. So we have va, tha, ta, sha, cha, and ha. I do like the lateral fricative a lot, the alveolar lateral fricative, so I added that to my conlang. Now we have ya as the palatal approximant, and again, our very famed alveolar lateral approximant that everyone loves, la. And if you notice, I did add some kind of romanization system using angle brackets here. So instead of writing this Greek theta for my dental fricative, I could just write th, and it would be a lot easier for me to transcribe sounds when I'm writing notes. And I developed a 6 vowel system. So we have e, u, e, o, and a. And last week I did talk about creating a lot of vowel clusters, but I kind of thought like maybe they should be diphthongs instead. So we have I, ao, and ao, and I also have eo and oi. And if you notice in a lot of these diphthongs, the e and o are a bit lowered. So they become e and o in these diphthongs. That being said, there's still e and o, which are still closed mid vowels. And I also have I, and u. I also worked on my syllable structure for this. So I'm allowing for 3 consonants, a maximum of 3 consonants as an onset and a maximum of 1 consonant as a coda. So CP here represents my primary onset. So it could be any consonant. For example, I have the word b, which means floor. The b sound is the onset. And if there's a primary onset, I'm allowing for an additional consonant before that, but it could only be sa, sha, or another nasal consonant. So for example, we have boga, which means oven. Is the primary onset, and sta is that added. We have shvan, which means chair or tool or stool. And I have ngoidesh, which means so it's a very valid syllable structure here. And I also allow consonants after that onset. So it could be any fricative except for ha. So for example, in the word zbzeta, which means writing or tablet, or dra, which means ceremony. And I also develop allophonic rules. So if the vowel is beside a sonorant, specifically a voiced sonorant, because all the sonorants in my language are voiced, or if it's beside a voiced fricative, that kind of disappears and that consonant becomes the nucleus. So it becomes syllabified. For example, in this word ceremony, instead of it being pronounced dra, it becomes dra. And I added this little hook below the to represent that it's not syllabic. Instead, the r is syllabic here. So fricatives can become voiced next to other voiced consonants and voiceless next to other voiceless consonants. So let's take this word zbzeta. Because the s sounds are beside the b, it becomes voiced zbzeta. And vowel, instead of the vowel, that ta renders the v sound as voiceless. So vowel. And again, I did allow for nasal sounds to precede an onset. And specifically, if the n sound before consonant, if the n sound appears before any consonant, is going to assimilate with that. So it's going to render itself as the same place of articulation. So let's take this word, for example, bangkode. which means lantern. That n, normally it's alveolar, but because it's before a k sound, it's going to become uvular. So k is kind of velar, kind of uvular in that range. And because of this allophone, the n assimilates with that k. So it becomes ngejdim. And again, we also, in this word for clothing, we also exhibit the first allophonic rule with the I instead of dum is dum. And we also have the fricative voicing rule. So instead of ngej, it becomes rej. All right. So I showed you the example of the task, and I hope that you would be able to do it. But before that, do we have any questions, concerns, comments about this weekly task or the material you've learned for this workshop that we've done this week? In the first week, so June asked, how would I recommend people start picking sounds for their sound inventory? In the first week, I did mention that you could mention language you're inspired by. Maybe you want to take the sounds of those languages and incorporate it into your own. So I would recommend researching about the phonology of those languages. And really a quick Google search or just Wikipedia is perfectly fine. Wikipedia tends to not be too problematic or crazy about the phonology of certain languages. So you could take a look at their consonants. If you don't know how it sounds, I did link an interactive IPA chart for you to actually hear the speech sounds in the IPA. I could link it in the chat too. But also it's perfectly fine to choose sounds that you're totally comfortable with or that sound cool to you. That's okay. So for this workshop, I really just want you to go crazy and experiment a bit, see what sounds you find appealing. Of course, these are all going to be based on biases such as what your native language is, because maybe you'd be too used to your native language. But again, that's perfectly fine. Are there groups of consonants that are generally seen together across languages? I'm not sure if I understand your question, but I think you're asking if there are general trends with consonants across languages, and absolutely yes. So generally, we see certain consonants appear much more frequently than others. For example, if you have a bilabial consonant, it's mostly going to be voiced, and it's probably going to be some kind of sonorant, like ma. So there's languages where the only bilabial consonant is ma, and there's no pa or ba. If you have a velar consonant, for example, and if you only have one velar consonant, it's most likely going to be voiceless. It's probably also most likely going to be a plosive. And it all relates to how much energy it takes to pronounce those sounds. But also, different unrelated languages could exhibit similar traits in their phonology just based on where they are geographically. So if you look at a lot of languages in Southeast Asia, there's many unrelated language families, but you have a lot of the same sounds. You even have tones. Slightly confused about codas. Can a language both allow and not allow it for different words? Or is it just either? Let's take English, for example. So English can allow certain sounds to be codas, and it could also restrict certain sounds to be codas. So it doesn't just have to be either or, it could be specific sounds too. So in English, the h sound, the voiceless glottal fricative, is not allowed to be a coda. But every other consonant can. You could have na as a coda or pa or ba as codas. Or take Thai, for example. Thai only has a certain set of codas that are viable. So you could have ta, pa, ka, na, ma, na as codas, but not any other sound. So you could handpick what sounds could be codas and what can't. Organizing different sounds really two ways of pronouncing. I think what you mean is, are you talking about the difference between writing and how something is pronounced? Because in this workshop, we're not really dealing with writing, we're dealing with the actual sounds. And again, in linguistics, writing is not really a part of a language's structure. It's more so like a sociocultural additive or a sociocultural medium for language. Is there a list ranking the most common sounds across languages? I could try to search of a list. I don't know if someone created some kind of list out there. A lot of what I know about what sounds are common and uncommon is based on what I have for my phonetics classes, but I could get back to you on if you're interested. I'll try to find a list for you. Why aren't glottal stops considered non-pulmonic ejectives? Because to produce it, you need to completely stop airflow current. Well, you completely stop the airflow, but again, pulmonic consonants involve air pressure from your lungs. So when you pronounce a glottal stop, just like when you pronounce any other plosive or any other stop, you're bringing air from your lungs out to your vocal tract. So when you're pronouncing a glottal stop, you're still doing some kind of action with your lungs or your diaphragm. You're bringing air out of your lungs. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for joining the second workshop, and I hope to see you next workshop where we deal with more grammar. So we're moving past sounds and we're going to get into the wordy grammar of your con. We're going to actually generate sentences.